Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I am really excited about sharing this particular webcast with you. We had a meeting yesterday of the presenters to just talk about the material we wanted to share with you today, and none of us wanted to get off the phone because there was so much to talk about. So I'm really personally looking forward to the conversation. You know, it's interesting, after a year of going through a pandemic, there's been so much that we've all been grappling with. But I think one of the biggest stories coming out of the past year, obviously, is everything that people have been dealing with related to education. The pandemic has just brought a really unusual spotlight on so many frustrations that parents have with what their kids are dealing with. And one of the issues that we want to discuss today and draw people's attention to some of the deeper underlying foundational questions is this issue of kids having to go to the school that the neighborhood is assigned to them. There's a real connection to some much deeper policy history that our presenters today are going to talk about. You know, for me personally, I know, and I share this with a lot of you on the call today, it's something that you deal with in your own life. It's so entrenched in our culture that sometimes we don't even question the fact that you have to find a way to live in a good school district for your kids to go to a good school. But do we really have to accept that as a status quo? Well, our speakers today are going to challenge that presumption. They're going to talk a little bit about how we got here historically, which is fascinating, and they're going to present some paths forward for how we can possibly get out of that. So let me talk a little bit about who our presenters are, because they're super interesting people and I can't wait for you to meet them. Our first presenter is going to be Tim DeRoche, and he is the author of this fantastic book called A Fine Line, which talks about educational redlining, and he's going to explain a little bit more about what that is. One of the more interesting things about Tim is he has challenged all of us to elevate our Zoom game. Be sure you take a look at the behind him. He's got an original library card catalog in his office, which makes me admire him even more. And then secondly, we have Darrell Bradford, who is the executive vice president of a nonprofit called 50 Can. I love the title of this. It's so optimistic and forward-looking and speaks to the idea that we can make a difference. And Darrell's going to be talking about that. A few little backgrounds about him. On their website, his colleagues call Darrell the disruptor, and that's what we're going to hear from him about today. Also note that his Twitter bio is a reference to a shared favorite book that he and I have. We were talking, and I had this book that refers to his Twitter handle on my shelf behind me. Funny coincidence, really awesome creative guy. And then finally, we're going to hear from Lindsay Burke, who is one of my colleagues. She's the director of the Educational Center for Ed Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And she, along with another colleague of ours, Jude Schwalbach, has a brand new paper out, and that link is going to be in the handout for today's panel so that you can read that looks at all of these redlining issues that we're going to be discussing today. So in order to kick it off, I'm going to first ask Tim if you would talk a little bit and set the stage for us. You wrote the book, A Fine Line. I don't feel like I can hold this up often enough. People really need to get it and read it. Fascinating book. Talk to us a little bit about, you know, what is educational redlining, and give us a little bit of a context of what the connection between housing policy and ed policy is. It's just something we need to surface and have people actually focus on. Is not something that we just have to accept.
Sorry about that. First of all, thank you so much to the Heritage Foundation, to Charmaine and Lindsay for having me today. I've been geeking out on these issues for the past 5 years, and so really appreciate the opportunity to share the work with other interested folks. So this all got started when I started thinking about some things that were going on in my own neighborhood. I live about 2 miles north of downtown Los Angeles. And maybe Catherine, you can put up the map slide. We can talk through some of the things that we see going on here. All right, can everybody see that? I think so.
Yeah, it looks good.
This is a map of my neighborhood in northeast Los Angeles. And the red school there in the middle is a school called Mount Washington Elementary. Mount Washington Elementary is a very coveted school. People work hard to get their kids into that school, a very high performing school. It's up on the hill in an older neighborhood of Los Angeles. Basically what you see is the surrounding schools are much lower performing schools. And this is a pattern that plays out in cities across the country, all regions of the country, where you see very, very disparate forms of achievement, types of achievement, and patterns of demographics between schools that really serve the same neighborhood. And so when you look at Mount Washington Elementary, their reading proficiency for their kids is up around 75%. They are 60% white and about 85% non-low income, right? And so the surrounding schools, very, very different, right? I think only one of the schools of these 7 surrounding schools has reading proficiency up around 50%, and there are a couple down in the teens. And so what you see is parents in our neighborhood spend an inordinate amount of time figuring out how to get their kids into Mount Washington. So how do you get your kids into Mount Washington? The short answer is you move within the red dotted line, right? The district draws these zones. These are not district boundaries. The boundaries between school districts are typically determined through the political process. These are lines that are drawn by bureaucrats in the bowels of the LA Unified School System, and they draw a line showing who gets privileged access to Mount Washington Elementary and who is kept out. Because the demand is so high for that school, if you live on one side of the line, you're guaranteed entrance, and if you live on the other side of the line, you are guaranteed that you will not be able to go. All the other schools on this page have attendance zones, but they don't mean anything because LA Unified, like many other urban school districts, is suffering from a crisis of under enrollment. And so if you want to move your kid to one of these other schools, they are not full, but Mount Washington is full. So, you know, what you see also is big housing price distortions, right? So if you want to live on the right side of that red line, on the inside of that red line, you're going to pay $200,000 more, $250,000 more for an equivalent home. It really distorts the real estate market, and this is something we see in other schools around Los Angeles. About halfway through my research into this, I started thinking, well, this is not the first time that our country has drawn maps in order to determine who is eligible or ineligible to receive valuable government services, right? Catherine, could you go to the next slide, please? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with these maps. These are the infamous redlining maps that were drawn during the New Deal era by the federal government. These maps were drawn to determine the desirability of neighborhoods. So the yellow and the pink areas were the non-desirable areas. The blue and the green were the desirable areas. You had an easier time getting home loans and housing assistance if you were in the blue and green areas designated by the federal government. The red and yellow areas were the areas of town, typically with much higher proportions of immigrants and minorities, especially African Americans. So let's go to the next page. So what you can see here is our attempt to marry the two maps. And this is one example. This is again from the same area of Los Angeles, my neighborhood of Los Angeles. And what you can see is that the redlining map, the colors are from the redlining map from the 1930s. And you can see the dotted area is the attendance zone of Mount Washington Elementary, the coveted school in the neighborhood. And you can see that it pretty much replicates lays on top of the desirable area from that map from the 1930s. And the areas that are yellow and red are still the areas of town where you have higher concentrations of people of color and immigrants. So very, very problematic. And what we found is that this is not solely constricted to LA, right? This is a problem that a pattern that replicates itself across the country. So if we could go to the next page, here are two schools in Brooklyn, right? Very same pattern, right? You see very high percentage of reading proficiency for PS8, very low for PS307. You can see that in this case, many of the kids who are zoned to go to PS307, the struggling school, actually live closer to PS8 Robert Fulton. And very strong demographic differences, 20% low income at Robert Fulton, 85% at Daniel Hale Williams. We can go to the next page. So this is Chicago. This is the example that I start off with in my book. Just want to say a couple quick words here. This one is perhaps the most stark. Lincoln Elementary is one of the crown jewels of the Chicago Public Schools. This is the north side of Chicago. These both serve the Old Town neighborhood of Chicago. Manier Elementary is a school, it's a failing school by any measure. In the last time they did testing, I think in 2019, not a single 8th grader tested proficient in reading, 99% African American. And you can see these school, and then Lincoln Elementary is 80% proficiency, 70% white. These are very, very stark differences for schools that are almost exactly a mile apart. I want to note, some people just say, well, this is just, there's no way to avoid this, right? These lines just, they reflect differences in our neighborhoods and our society, and we can't get away from it. But I look at, in the book, I look at two health clinics, right? One health clinic that is on the north side of North Avenue. So you see that attendance zone boundary there, the checkered pattern is the attendance zone boundary. I look at one health clinic that's on the north side and one that's on the south side. And what you see is that both have patient ratings. If you look on Google, they got patient ratings that are up around 4.5, 4.6. And you can imagine that maybe the health clinic that's on the south side of North Avenue, maybe that one serves a higher percentage of low-income residents. Maybe there's a higher percentage of African Americans that go to that health clinic on the south side because that's primarily where the African American residents live. However, they are free, everyone is free to cross North Avenue to attend either one. And so you don't see the stark patterns of differences. And my guess is that the demographic differences between those two health clinics would not be anywhere near as stark as the two schools, which are divided by this line that is drawn by the Chicago Public Schools. Chicago Public Schools is actually obligated by state civil right law in Illinois to redraw the lines to address, to basically avoid segregation of the races and the classes. And they just have failed to do that, and no one has held them accountable. So just want to make the note that this is a very unusual way to determine who is eligible for a government service. And so I think we're going to talk about some ways that we might be able to move away from this system.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Tim. It's just, when I hear you talk about this, it just gets me really energized, because it's like peeling back and looking at something that we've all lived with all of our lives, but understanding now that there's real deep history behind it. And you used the word privileged in terms of the kids being able to get into those good schools. And I think that's really interesting, because we have a lot of conversation about privilege in our culture today, but we're not bringing that across and really shining that focus on the fact that this neighborhood system of school assignment is a form of privilege. And there's a real question of justice and fairness for families who feel trapped and feel that they have no way to get their kids into better schools and out of their failing neighborhood schools. So that was a great setup. I want to bring Darrell in. Darrell, you were recently featured in a video that looked at this connection between federal redlining policies and education access. And one of the things that I found really interesting about some things that you've written is you've posted a picture online of the home that you grew up in inner city Baltimore, which is right down the road from me. And you went, though, from inner city Baltimore to graduating from UPenn. So you're a big believer in pathways that education can provide for kids. But talk to us a little bit about how you think that system is corrupted right now, and what we need to be doing to address it.
Yeah, so I'd like to thank the Heritage Foundation, and thank you, Dr. Yost, for having me here today. I'd also like to thank Tim for writing his book so I can do a cool video about what's in the book. But it's a great read for anybody who is watching. I urge you to check it out. So, when you're a kid, there are conversations that go on all around you, and they're sort of like meaningless, and they don't drop into context until much later in your life. And so one of the earliest conversations I can remember, my mother and my grandmother at the kitchen table talking about whose address we were going to use so I could go to the middle school in the Mount Royal part of, it's called Mount Royal, in the Bolton Hill part of Baltimore, instead of Harlem Park, which was the middle school I was zoned for, which is in the Sandtown part of Baltimore, which is actually the school that Michelle Rhee first taught at, for whatever reason that is. And so the only school I ever went to that was the school I was zoned for was the first one. I had an aunt who taught in the Baltimore City public school system, so I got this like incredible leg up getting into all these schools that I never would have gone to. And I didn't think that was strange until, again, like much later in life, when I sort of woke up to the fact that there are 4 ways that people sort of navigate schools and kind of navigate school choice. You are lucky, like me. You have, like an aunt, or you get a scholarship. You go to an independent school, as I did in the end, for which I'm sort of eternally grateful. You're rich, so you load yourself up on the right mortgage, you pay for tuition, you do, any of those things. You're connected, right? So you know somebody, you basically work in the influence market, which is something that Joel Klein talked about when he took over the New York City public schools, for instance. There was an office that specifically just made sure that connected people got their kids into the public schools that they wanted to get them in, right? Or you lie, which is the most sort of conventional and maybe widely used form of school choice. You tell people you live someplace that you don't live, you go to a school that you don't normally go to, and you can go to jail for that, And so it wasn't until sort of much later in life, working on education policy and these other things, that I realized that one of the schools I went to was in the Roland Park section of Baltimore, which is like a wonderful sort of leafy designed community by Frederick Olmsted, right? Who designed Central Park, but who was also one of the chief architects of redlining and housing segregation policy, which I didn't know, again, until like much later in life. He and the folks that he worked with were, sort of pioneered restrictive covenants, right? Which are like highly local lease arrangements that meant some people could move to a place and some people couldn't. And in the case of Roland Park, and there was an exhibit about this in Maryland recently. The letters from the person who was running the Roland Park Corporation say, how do we structure this so that African Americans and Jewish people cannot move to Roland Park, right? So all of that grows out of policy that started in the New Deal. With the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Roosevelt administration, that basically, one, color-coded America, as Tim showed in his maps, and 2, decided that it would finance the housing purchases of some people, mainly white people, and wouldn't finance those purchases for other people, those being largely people of color, new immigrants, and a bunch of other stuff. And there are other policies that live in that, that I'm sure Dr. Burke will talk about as well. But it's frustrating because like now being an adult, right? Like now knowing that at every stage of the process, I was basically, breaking this rule of racist school assignment in a lot of respects. Everything that lives on top of that, most specifically school finance, that is anchored in property wealth, right? And the deleterious effect that these boundaries and federal policy on mortgages and all this other stuff had on people's housing wealth, and by virtue of that, their ability to finance their schools, that kind of stuff. It's just awful, like when you sort of add it all up. So I for one am sort of excited about the fact that this conversation has spilled over into the public mind, whether or not you care about sort of undoing racial injustice, or whether or not you believe that your zip code shouldn't be the thing that determines where you go to school. I think there's a unique opportunity to merge these two approaches, although there are other approaches as well, into a solution that works well for all Americans of all income levels and in all different places. So thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for that, Darrell. That's so fascinating, and you're teeing it up exactly to the question that I very much want to ask, and I think is on everyone's minds. Anytime I've been doing public policy a really long time, and I think one of the things that's more frustrating for a lot of us is the dichotomy that you seem to always have in issues, right? And the polarization has been increasing so much over the years. And so it's really unusual to find an issue where there's these really cross-cutting alignments, right? And this one just, it busts up so many preconceptions that people have of where conservatives might be, where liberals might be.
Totally
and
agree.
Honestly, it is the liberal teacher use unions who are very carefully guarding this system, right? But so many of the values that they've advocated over the years run exactly counter to this kind of a system. And so I want to ask the super hard question of, and I'm hoping that you guys will chime in on this when we come back around to throwing it open to a larger discussion. But Lindsay Burke, come join us. Turn your camera on, and I'm going to throw this one right at you. How do we bust these paradigms and make a difference and change these policies?
Yeah, well, thank you, Charmaine. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. Thanks especially to Tim and to Darrell for joining us. So I think both Tim and Darrell started to get into the historical aspect of this. How did we get to where we are today? And as Darrell pointed out, there were official practices historically pertaining to zoning and mortgage lending, and along with what Darrell pointed out, restrictive covenants at the local levels. And these really impacted the shape of neighborhoods across America. And the effect of those practices, as Tim showed us, was illustrated through these redlining maps that were created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation and then really advanced by the Federal Housing Administration a few years later. So just a quick history to dive a little bit deeper. In 1933, the Franklin Roosevelt administration established the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which purchased mortgages that were at risk of foreclosure, largely due to the Great Depression. And then that was important because for the first time, that actually provided low interest loans with 15-year repayment schedules, which wasn't the case prior to the HOLC's establishment. But as Tim pointed out, once established, the HOLC made these color-coded maps of the majority. I think it was 239 neighborhoods across the country. And those maps, like he showed, denoted desirable areas in blue and green, and then these hazardous or declining areas in red or yellow. And it's interesting to follow the scholarly debate around the impact of these maps today, because it is ongoing. What impact did they have, and what direction did the impact go? So some scholars will argue that the HOLC maps, rather than being the genesis of this discriminatory lending policies, these policies instead really reflected existing local practices that were in place. But either way, those maps reinforced that racial segregation in the housing sector, really codified those boundaries that were already in place. It codified those restrictive covenants that were in place that had been developed by homeowners associations and others. And so we can really see the impact illustrated through those maps. The other aspect, I think, of this scholarly debate is that the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, that was established just a year later in 1934, that really had more of an impact, did more to reinforce racial housing segregation than the HOLC did. And we can see this through something known as the Underwriting Manual that the FHA developed when it was established. And what that manual did was it created these uniform underwriting standards, and it distributed those manuals to every FHA underwriter across the country. And it is fair, right, for someone, an entity that is providing home loans to have some standards. But if you read what these standards were, they go far beyond just your basic evaluation of how sound a home might be, for example, which was included in the underwriting manual. Things like the architectural attractiveness, that was included as well. That makes sense. Resistance to elements, that makes sense. However, that manual also included incredibly nefarious underwriting standards, such as whether there were, quote, incompatible racial and social groups present in a neighborhood. Reminder, these were government documents that were published with this language in them. And so how does this connect to the broader conversation? How does this impact education policy? Well, that underwriting manual made explicit the link between housing and schooling in that manual. Let me just read you one quote. It states, quote, if the children of people living in a desirable area are compelled to attend school, where the majority or a considerable number of pupils represent a far lower level of society or an incompatible racial element, the neighborhood under consideration will prove far less stable and desirable than if this condition did not exist, end quote. So there was an explicit connection there between your neighborhood and your school in that underwriting manual. So in the 1960s, we see the federal government step in, we see Congress step in, introduce bills to prohibit, in particular, school districts from drawing the types of attendance zone boundaries that Tim described, but drawing them in such a way that would perpetuate racial imbalance. So the federal government steps in and says you can no longer do this as a school district if you're drawing those boundaries to perpetuate this racial imbalance. But even though they did that, it didn't do anything, of course, and this is a point Richard Rothstein makes, to reverse the patterns that had already become deeply embedded within those school districts. And so this is why today we still feel those ripple effects in education. There is a strong link. Too often, if you read Tim's book, which I commend to you, you will see this clearly. There is a strong link between those 1930s era redlining maps and the attendance zone boundaries that are still in place in school districts today, those boundaries within their borders that they draw. And this is why I think it's a big part of the reason why unevenness in educational opportunity persists. It is because schooling is tied to housing. 71% of students attend a school that is assigned to them based on where their home is located. So I will say, and then I'll hand it back to Charmaine, that there is a specific remedy for this problem that persists, and that is eliminating attendance zone boundaries within districts, allowing students to attend any public school within their district, and then of course marrying that policy with broader private school choice options as well.
Lindsay, just a micro question. I mean, looking at Tim's phenomenal charts, it really, the squiggly lines make me think of political gerrymandering. Is this educational gerrymandering?
I think one could certainly put it that way. I think that's a very apt description.
Yeah. So we've got a great audience with us today, and we want to make this as dynamic and interactive as we possibly can. So for those of you who are online with us, please go to your link over on the side where you can put questions, and Lindsay's going to look through those for us, and we're going to keep talking while we offer you all the opportunity to ask questions. You know, Tim, you mentioned, I mean, you live in LA. It's notorious for being a very difficult place to buy into. So how would you respond to somebody who says, you know, anytime you go in and break up long-standing methods of doing things, you run into a problem of stakeholders who bought in under the previous system. So you went in, you paid a premium for a house in a neighborhood, and these pesky people come around and say, hey, it's not fair, we're not going to do things that way anymore, and then all of a sudden that house doesn't have the same kind of value. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid concern, and I think my book. I don't want to shame any parents for any reaction to the current system, right? There are scarce seats in the best public schools, right? They are scarce. And as Darrell pointed out, there are several different ways that folks try to get their kids access to the best public education possible. And so there are folks who buy into an attendance zone, folks who buy into a school district, a suburban school district that has very high levels of performance. There are folks that work the system, right, and use consultants to find alternative ways, like Darrell described. There are alternative ways of getting your kids into schools that your kid that may not be the assigned school. People lie about their address, right? It's something that, you know, in talking to folks at dinner parties and cocktail parties over the past 5 years, everyone either has lied about their address, or their parents lied about their address, or their friend lied about their address. And this is up and down the economic spectrum. This is not something that is, you know, only low income people do or only high income people do. Everyone, it's part of the American fabric, right? So I don't want to shame anybody, and I can understand folks who are protective of their property values, but I I'm very concerned of just about the effect on the social compact that these policies have, right? People always ask me, well, you think you're gonna switch those kids to the school a mile down the road, and suddenly those kids who aren't proficient in reading, suddenly they're gonna be proficient in reading? Well, no, those things don't change overnight. And I do think it would probably be better if all of our most struggling students were concentrated in a handful of schools. I don't think that's the best way to do it. But even more important than the educational attainment is just the effect on the social compact, right? These folks live within walking distance of good public schools, and they are tax-paying constituents of the district. They are paying for the 12 and 15 million and 20 million dollar renovations of these schools, and yet they can't walk over to that school and enroll their kid. It's just very troubling, and I think what I've found, Charmaine, is that liberal-minded folks, right, who don't have kids, when I tell them about the system, um, um, they are appalled, right? Then when they have kids, they utilize this system. Many of them buy into one of these zones. They've got BLM signs out front, but they're like, no, 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 don't take away my zones. They do not want to talk to me if they've got kids in elementary school or middle school. But what I've also found is that around the time their youngest child, right, is a junior in high school, suddenly they're willing to have conversations with me and say, yeah, this probably isn't the way we should do it, right? This isn't the way I want my kids to be having to access a good public education, right? You know, we don't want to tie these two important pillars of our lives together, like housing and education. Now, that doesn't mean proximity doesn't matter. Like I have two young kids. Finding a school close to us that we think is good for our kids, like proximity to our house, matters a tremendous amount. I just don't think we can draw maps that say, hey, these people are eligible to go to this school and these are not. I just think it's very damaging to the social compact, and I think we don't want to drive up property values, right? The federal government over the past 15 years, maybe even longer, has been pursuing policies that drive up the value of homes. That's not what we want as a society. We want housing to be affordable for young families, right? And so I can understand any given person. I mean, I have concerns about my property value. I'm obviously happier when my home is rising and has a higher value, but that's not what we want as a society overall. Overall, we want housing to be inexpensive. We don't want to be distorting it to drive up prices and to make it harder for our kids to buy houses in the future. I don't think that's what we want.
Yeah, no, that's those so many good points. I have 5 kids, so I've lived this for a very long period of time and seen a lot of different things happen. You know, there's a lot of ramifications of it too. I know of one kid, for example, who lost an entire year's of sports eligibility because the family moved. They didn't want to fess up to it because it would be damaging to the kid's career, and they got discovered. And I mean, it was just this mess of a chain of events that was all happened because of these boundaries that that couldn't be worked around. So given that that is the system, and it has all these ramifications, Darrell, I'm going to go back to where I started with 50 can. I love the optimism of can. Why? Why do you think we can make a difference? Talk to me about that. And what are the barriers that when you get up in the morning and you're like, okay, I'm going to go make a difference and crack this system? What are the barriers that you're targeting?
Well, I mean, I love windmills, so that's part of it. And I think, just to Tim's point, like renters suffer this as well, right? Because like, even if you don't own a house, if you move to an apartment that's near a desired school, you pay for it in the same fashion. So the problem is not merely one that is passed on to homeowners. So just like a couple of things. The first thing I just want to say, and maybe we talk about this more later, but one issue I think is that like we're just locked in this awful paradigm right now, and it is a paradigm of scarcity, and it is one that pits two groups of people who are both getting played against one another, right? So on the one hand, there are at the risk of being flipped, my people who we're zoned into these bad places, and historically have not had our housing wealth appreciate in a way that that folks who are not zoned in these places have, and that does have a profound effect. And we also don't have a lot of choice, right? So, Dr. Yost, to your point, like if you grow up in, like in Newark 20 years ago, you went to the monopoly, right? And the teachers union had a stranglehold over everything that went on there. And if you got into I think it was Ann Street School, was that the one? That was the one that all the politicians sent their kids to. And if you went to science or arts, right, you got a good education because they were the selective schools, right? So that is the experience on one side, and that is an awful experience, right? That is grounded in residential assignment. On the other side, you have, young families who are, to Tim's point, who are almost never in this discussion, and you have families who have made a bet on a house for a school they think they want before they even have a kid, right? And so I mean, this is like the random of random. Like, I would not take those odds, and so they too are locked into a paradigm around residential assignment that is not optimal, right? It is expensive and it is uncertain. And both of these groups have an interest in not having where you go to school be tied to where you live. So I just want to put that out there, because I think the solving of this problem it's two different problems with the same root for very different groups of people. So I want to put that out there. The other thing I just want to say is, like, I'm like a little bit hopeful about this for two reasons. Like, one is that we actually know it is possible to make great schools without tying them to where you live. That like anybody heard of Exeter? Right? You don't have, like, you have to go there to live, right? So like private schools know how to do this, right? Charter schools know how to do this. Like, selective magnets or theme schools, they know how to do this. It is not like we don't have the engines of school creation and governance that can help us make great schools without regard to attendance zones. So that's a good thing, right? It's not like we have to invent the device to do this. The other thing I think, and just to be like very, very pointed about it, I'm like excited sounds awful, but I am enthused about the fact that there are millions of Americans who are in the I bought the right house paradigm, who realized this year, after this year, that they had no control over what goes on at their local schools. And like, I don't know if you're on team reopen or team not reopen or whatever, but I know there are lots of people who are like, yo, I'm giving up my whole life to live in this house, and I can't send my kid down the street to school anymore. the terms of the deal had changed. Like when did that happen? No one consulted me, you know. And I think there's an opportunity to sort of engage lots of people in this discussion about like not marrying school and address, who thought that they bought their way out of the problem, who have now found out that they just had a little more cushion against the problem than other folks do.
Yeah, no, those are such good points. We've got about 5 minutes left, and we've got two questions that are very similar, and I want to marry them together and toss this to you, Lindsay, because this is an area of your expertise, which is looking at the technical structure of what a different way of funding schools would look like. One of our attendees is asking about, you know, how do you bring accountability to public schools and perhaps take that money and allow private schools to compete for it. Another person is asking about Education Hope scholarships. And so there's a couple of different ideas coming from our attendees about asking what structural kinds of changes might look like. And I know, since you and I've talked about this a fair amount, that this is part of your expertise. So I'd like for you to talk a little bit about what structural change might lock like.
Yeah, thanks, Charmaine. So those are great questions. And you know, I think that's really the heart of the problem overall, right? Is fundamentally how we finance K-12 education. We fund systems, right? This is the whole discussion we're having today, is because we fund a system and then we assign kids to that system with no regard for fit, safety, the aspirations of the child or the family, the values that the family might hold, and the alignment or misalignment that might come with assigning a kid to a particular school. And so everything that we're talking about today, in addition to the historic aspects of housing redlining, is a function of the fact that we fund systems rather than students. And so if we want to break this system open and provide for robust choice, robust competition, for myriad options that pop up to meet the needs of kids across the country, we have to shift the way that we finance K-12 education. And you know, I've long believed in the way Milton Friedman described it all the way back in 1955, that just because we publicly finance education does not require government schooling and government delivery of that education. And so Friedman had said, yes, of course, let's publicly finance education, but let's separate the delivery of education from its financing, separate the services from how we pay for it. So public financing, but allow families to take that money not only to any public school of choice, but any private option of choice. And, you know, Charmaine, you know this well because we've been talking about it over the past few days, but literally in the past 2 weeks, we have seen yet another enormous explosion in school choice growth across the country, which has just been phenomenal to see. West Virginia, a week and a half ago, has now signed into law a completely universal education savings account. Nearly every child in the state in West Virginia, if they want it, will now have access to their share of the public per pupil dollars that are spent on them in their assigned public school, and they can then take that money to whatever education option is the right fit for them, private or otherwise, in the form of an ESA. Kentucky followed suit less than 24 hours later, not universal, but a really excellent ESA option that's in place. And right now, as we sit here, there are 30 state legislatures that are considering some form of private school choice, partly in response, I think, to COVID and this lack of education continuity for children. But I do think even more broadly, just in recognition of the fact that funding children rather than systems is the way to go. And look, I'll stop with this. We would not be, as a country, unique in moving in this direction. This is something Sweden did decades ago, right? And it works beautifully for them. So we see it across the world. We're seeing it in states across the country. So I am just as optimistic, maybe, as Darrell and you know the name of his organization, that I do think it is possible moving forward. Hopefully, 10 years from now, we'll be in a position where we have fundamentally reconsidered how we finance K-12 education, and we're funding every single child day one from kindergarten forward with an ESA.
So we have only 1 minute left, but we have so many good questions that I really want to get to. There's one here that I think is a hard question, and so I'm going to do moderator's privilege, and Darrell, I'm going to throw it to you, and I'm asking you to be as brief as you can on a super complex question, which is, we have a gentleman who's a retired Black attorney, and he says he gave I encourage you to read it afterward, some personal anecdotes about seeing the difficulty of integrating schools. And that's really what we're talking about here, is opening up opportunity for people to self-choose an integrative system, more than what we have now. But none of us are naive enough to think that that wouldn't create societal pressures and challenges for the system. Having grown up in the inner city, and you've shared a little bit about your experiences going to different schools, can you talk a little bit about that? And do you have some insight to that question? I think that's a very perceptive question, actually.
Yeah, so I didn't integrate my high school, but I integrated my high school. I was the only Black kid in my class for 3 of the 4 years I was in high school. And it is a tremendous burden, which I didn't really realize until much later in life, to be like the Black kid who goes and represents your people, right, to other people. It's a big deal, and it's a lot to ask of any kid. That said, 2 quick things. One is I support school integration, but I think that the best way to do it is on a voluntary basis, because voluntary communities are communities that are sticky, and sort of centrally planned ones are harder to keep together. And I think adopting this sort of set of policies is a better way to do this. The other thing I would just say is that the opposite is also true. The set of policies we have right now basically make sure that will never happen, if you think that that is one strategy worth embracing. And I also think that just a more choice-forward environment is one that can let Black kids be in a voluntary community with other Black kids, which is also a more a highly coveted option that many families are interested in now.
Yeah, I just want to throw in here, I've often heard people like Diane Ravitch say, well, school choice, it was designed for, the reason we have people arguing for school choice is to maintain segregation or to resegregate the schools. That's why we need school assignment. We need residential assignment to avoid segregation, which is just mind-bogglingly naive, because if you abolished all charter schools tomorrow and you sent every single one of those kids back to their assigned schools, we would still have extremely segregated schools. So we're giving up all of this choice, and we're not solving the problem that you're telling me that the system is meant to solve in any way. Like, we're not solving it at all. So I totally agree with Darrell. You want to encourage that over time, but it has to be voluntary. The government can't make those decisions for people.
I think it's interesting from a political perspective. We've had some internal polling that we've seen that has been absolutely fascinating and really does break people's paradigms in terms of who supports school choice and who doesn't. There is, I think, a little bit of a paternalistic narrative of this idea that somehow lower income and inner city families aren't involved as much and don't care as much in their kids' education. And I'm thinking of one of the private schools here in the DC area that parents just try so hard to sacrificially send their kids to, the Cornerstone Academy. Parents try really, really hard to get their kids in there, and it's because they're looking for ways to get their kids out of failing public schools that their kids have been assigned to. And so our polling data shows just a real support for these policies among parents who are looking for there to be a change and looking for options and choice for them to make a difference for their kids' long-term lives. Well, listen, we are out of time, and we at the Heritage Foundation, we like to keep our commitment to you guys to do this in exactly the time frame that we said that we would. We will go back and look at your questions very specifically and do our best to get back to you. Someone asked about follow-up material, and we will absolutely commit to you that there will be more material on this. And I just want to specifically thank Tim and Darrell for your willingness to come and loan us your expertise for this last hour. And also, Lindsay, even though I get to work with you, I appreciate your leadership in making this event happen and helping us to get the work that Tim and Darrell are doing out to a wider audience. So, and to our attendees, thank you so much for engaging with us on this issue, and I hope you will continue to do so. We will have a recording of this that we will be making available, and we hope that you all have enjoyed this content. Will help us get it to a larger audience as well. And so thank you all and have a great rest of your day.